Today is May 21st, 2019. I'm Adrienne Felice, and it is my honor to be here with Sally, Jessy, Raphael for the interviews An Oral History of Television, and we are in Pawling, New York. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today.
Thank you.
So we'd just like to get some background information to start out. So first question is, what was your name at birth?
Good question. I don't know. I think my first name, I would have to go and look at a birth certificate, which I don't know where it is. Now, you're going to have problems with me. Here's the problem. I've lived so long and worked so many places, so many things, that I can't put dates correctly. People will call in and they'll tell me. But aside from that, I remember that my first, I think on the birth certificate, the first name is Raphael. That I think. Aside from that, you're on your own, girl.
So last name?
Don't know.
Okay. So how did you start to be known as Sally, Jessy, Raphael then?
I joined the union and they had a Sally Jessy. And you can't have two performers, or couldn't in those days, with the same name. So we stuck the first name on the back.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Easton, Pennsylvania,
And what year?
1935.
And did you grow up there?
No.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up a lot of different places, in New York, suburbs, and in Puerto Rico, and in, trying to think of where else. My father had an apartment in Washington, D.C. I was probably there a while. A lot of different places.
And tell us a little bit about your parents. What were they like?
Ah, great. I had, it's very hard to make it in show business unless you've had bad parents, because you've got nothing to rail against. So, unfortunately, I was blessed with wonderful parents. Now, I had a very beautiful mother, stage mother. The most maligned people in show business are the stage parents. If you didn't have stage parents, you wouldn't have people who know how to play the violin. Who the heck wants to go practice? Or would become good in fencing or in the theater or whatever. So to a certain amount, you need, that movie Gypsy, that destroyed everything, and it's absolutely wrong. That's the stereotype, and it isn't true of most stage parents. My father, on the other hand, was the kind of man who loved people. When he would get into an elevator, which, by the way, he'd bet on. Father was really good at gambling, and I think I've inherited some of that. At least I hope I have. He would he knew every elevator operator in the office building he worked in New York, what their kids' names were. He would talk to anybody and everybody. And to a certain extent, I haven't inherited that familiarity with everyone, but my daughter has. She talks to anyone.
So you said your mom was a stage mom. Were you interested in performing when you were little then?
I guess I was. I think I always knew from day one that I always thought from day one I wanted to be an actor. And it took a long time and a circuitous route to do it. But she didn't exploit me, but she enabled me.
So did you take classes in acting when you were
Did
little?
I ever take classes? I took classes in anything there'd be to take classes in. I took ballet, and I took modern dance, and I took tap dancing. And I took sword fighting and épée fighting, and I took I had to play the violin because you had to play a musical instrument, and I had to take speech lessons so that I would speak gas. Gas is Great American Speech, meaning no regional accent. If I stand up and a lot of people stand up, and somebody like Edith Skinner, who always knew regional accents, she could never find mine. Uh, it's just good American speech.
What were some of your other interests?
When I was a kid, let's see, interests. Uh, I was a reader, and I have been a reader my whole life. And I find that the world is divided into those that read and those that don't. And I think an interesting fact is I think people who read earn more money than people who don't read. Now, it doesn't matter fiction, nonfiction, or whatever, but I was prodigious as a prodigious reader, maybe 3 books a day.
Wow. Any particular kind of books?
Anything. Anything. I've read the classics. I'll read anything.
What about things like radio and television? Were you interested in broadcasting when you were little?
Yes. When I was 6 years old, I got a job on a show on NBC called Quiz Kids. And it was with Dick Van Dyke and his wife.
Dick Van Patten?
Dick Van Patten, sorry. And his wife, Joyce. And I had them both on the television show, maybe 60 years later. And he looks at me and says, "You look familiar." And I said, I didn't remember that you were a quiz kid. So I was a quiz kid. And the job was grown-ups gave us, in fact, Cal Burnett is doing a show like that now. Grown-ups give you their problems and kids solve the problems. So you had 6 years old solving the problems.
So was this at 30 Rock?
No, I don't even know if there was a 30 Rock. Hey, honey, we're going back 78 years. No, it was in a studio. Took place in a studio. I don't know that I was on it for terribly long. I know that my mother, who said, "That's enough. Now we'll go back to being a child and taking lessons and going to school and learning as much as you can."
How did you feel about that? Did you want to pursue those things more?
I think I didn't care.
Yeah.
I thought this is all part of life and it doesn't matter. When I was in high school, I went to work at the Westport Country Playhouse for 2 seasons as an intern, and in fact appeared in a play, Top Man with Ralph Meeker and Detective Story with John Forsythe. And that they were taking pre-Broadway. And we went out of town with it. I was way underage, lying about my age, but I was always terribly tall for my age. In fact, I remember once my parents didn't know, I overheard, they said, "She's going to be a giant." Well, I'm slightly under 5 feet tall. And the thing people say when they see me is, "What happened?" Well, I never was tall, but cameras shoot up. So those were good days. And I worked in an interesting summer stock. I worked in Waitsfield, Vermont, when I was about 10 or 11 for Philip Burton. And he brought his adopted child along, Richard Burton. And Irving Penn was the photographer for this small band, and we went around to all the towns. It was called the, don't remember. We went around to small towns in Vermont, and we'd set up and do a play a night, pack it down, bus and truck, they used to call it in those days, meaning the people were on the bus and the truck had the sets. And that was very, very good training very early on. Amazing that my parents would let me do that at that age. But there was never a problem.
So it sounds like you were pretty serious about becoming an actress.
I was very serious.
So how did you then move from acting into radio
I
and
never
broadcasting?
did. I always acted. One of the things that people don't know about me is that I have made, as an actor, I've made about 53 movies. I changed my name. I changed my hair color. I changed the makeup. And I don't have big roles. Some of them were larger than others. But that's my hobby. And when I meet somebody who's producing a movie, I always beg them to let me do something in the movie. So I have been acting all of my life. After I got out of high school, I was with Geraldine Page in another show called The Empress. I was Nubian slave #1, wearing blackface, because Nubian slaves had blackface and were black, and the whole rigmarole over whiteface and blackface amused the heck out of me because of those days. It opened in Philly and closed in Boston, the play that is not me.
So then, did you study acting in college?
I went to Sarah Lawrence for 2 days, and I didn't like the fact women were wearing circle pins on their cashmere sweaters. I wanted to be more of a rebel, and I took the, in those days, to get into Carnegie Mellon, which I believe was Carnegie Tech, you had to do a audition, one tragedy, one comedy, and one Shakespeare. And I did it and got in and stayed in Pittsburgh studying drama happily, for about 2.5 years. And I was actually, I would sneak, it was a Scotch Presbyterian school. 2 things. I began to loathe the bagpipes. And the other thing was, they had a 7:30 curfew at Margaret Morrison School for Women. And I was in their dorm. And I would sneak out at night. And they caught me 3 times and told me it would be better off if I went home. Well, I didn't go home. I went to Columbia with classes in Barnard. But those classes taught at Columbia in those days were taught at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. And they were taught by all the anchormen who would get off the news. I'm having a hard time remembering who they were. It'll come to me when I'm thinking of something else, I'm sure.
John Cameron Swayze?
John Cameron Swayze taught me news. And
Patrick Kelly?
Yes, absolutely, Patrick Kelly. And that's where I finished up. And then the degree came from Barnard, and because I think there were no girls in Columbia at that time. So we lost the graduation certificate. Now cut back till about my 80th birthday, when my daughter was contacted by the New York Times, and they said they're writing my obit. So my daughter said, well, Mother will be glad to talk to you. Oh, really? Yeah, it's her life. So the New York Times contacted me. And then they asked me where I went to college. And I told them, and they said, oh, and I also eventually got a master's from the University of Puerto Rico in San German. They said, a lot of people fake their college education. So will you please prove it? I tore this house. I tore it upside down. I went everywhere. Whatever I did with that darn graduation certificate, I have no graduation certificates. I have no idea. Well, you would think it would be easy to just call the college and they'll say you graduated. They don't do that anymore. They have a company that gives the alumni their certificates by doing research. So it took a darn long time. But if I say I went there, they can prove it.
So what was your degree in from Barnard?
Bachelor of Fine Arts in fine art. Actually, I had the idea at that time that I would really love to make the exhibits for the Metropolitan or the MoMA. I'd like to be the person to make theatrical those exhibitions, to have people come and see it. So, Bachelor of Fine Arts, art history, anything to do with art.
So did you pursue that when you graduated, or what kind of jobs did you go after?
Oh, well, I went to college at night, and I worked as a switchboard operator for Screen Gems, which I think was part of Columbia Pictures. And I was fired for one of the suits came by my desk, and he said, "What's this?" I said, "It's the in basket, sir." And he said, "Why is there outgoing mail in the in basket?" And I said, "Somebody put it there." And he said, "If you can't run an in and out basket, then really, I don't think you will ever be able to amount to very much. Go to the cashier, get your check, and you're out of here." And that was me and CBS. We never met again.
So where did you go from there?
Well, I graduated college, and before that, I got married to a very nice man, and we moved to Puerto Rico, and he was the sales manager of WAPA TV, WAPA, and I got my first real full-time radio job on WHOA, thanks to Carmina Mendez, and I was the morning person on WHOA. I was paid $2 a show from, I think we went on at 8 o'clock and went off at 11. 4-hour show, paid $2. I worked 5 days a week. That was $10. Andrew was getting a big sum of money, $4,000 a year, as sales manager for WAPA TV. So I learned to play the horses. And unbeknownst to my husband, I played them very well. The reason I played them well was, let's just say, I knew who was going to win. Someone told me. And as long as I didn't make any outrageous bets and stuck to $2 for an exacta, I was allowed to make enough money for us to live on. Andrew had quite a well-to-do father who was an unusual man. He was terribly thrifty, to say the least. I've always hated people who are tight with money. I don't think it's a virtue. Spend and it'll come in, is my theory. So, when we were earning $4,000 a year plus my $2, we wrote to him and asked him for help. He sent me about 20 cans of geisha crab meat, which was his account as a man who who ran an ad agency. He was one of the American founders of Dentsu Advertising, and with Larry Valenstein, Gray Advertising. He didn't send us money. He sent me crab meat. I cannot ever look a crab in the face again. So those are some of the likes and dislikes.
So talk a little bit about starting out on radio. Was this your first official job in broadcasting?
In
Puerto Rico?
Puerto Rico, on radio, well, broadcasting would have been Quiz Kids on NBC.
Right.
But yes, that was the first one. And as the morning man, it was very, very good training. And it was very unusual because there were no women in radio. And that Puerto Rico allowed me to do that. And from alongside of radio, I worked for WHOA and went right out of my head. WNE, no. Call letters are gone.
KYN?
KYN. WKYN. But I then got my first television show, and that would be in the late 50s. I had a very interesting television career in Puerto Rico. First, people should know that the cameras were enormous, enormous. And it would take two cameramen, not one. Today, some guy with one little camera takes your picture. In those days, cameras were just enormous. The lights were so hot, so that you would get up to 120 degrees under television lights in those days. And you wore makeup this thick, a kind of a brown makeup that would be that thick all over your face. The first television show I did was a show where I was the only woman with a bunch of handsome bachelors. And it was called What Do Men Want, If Anything? Anything was my parenthesis. My second television show was a show in which a man named Henry Corona, who was Trujillo from the Dominican Republic's chef, private chef, he and I stood in front of a table where Henry cooked a dish. We said the name of the dish today is chicken parmesan. We never described the ingredients. We never talked about the cooking. What we did was we gossiped, heavy, heavy gossip. And I had people who the station would pay money to tell us who was sleeping with whom, who was going out with whom, who was robbing whom. And we let all of that out on the air. It was an enormous hit in Central and South America. And I believe it was the first show done in Spanglish. You could watch this show if you spoke either Spanish or English or both and understand it perfectly. Because Henry and I were able to speak fluently both languages. The third show was something I hate talking about it, and I'll tell you why. I always felt somebody would steal it. And maybe they will, but I guess I'm now too old, so good luck to them. When the news was over, the 6 o'clock news was over, the lights would go out. They didn't go to commercial, they went to black. And then the lights came on in the newsroom. And at the desk, instead of the sports reporter, was a snake. Instead of the anchor woman was a woman with pearls. All of the people who appear in a news program were puppets. And I was the only live human being. I was kind of a roving reporter. And what we did off the top of our heads was satirize the news that we had just heard. So, if it was a story about some celebrity, the snake would report on it, changing everything to snake them. And that show, again, people who didn't even watch the news watched that show. It's one of the shows, I did it with a man named Art Merrill. It was one of the shows I was most proud of. And the reason is not every actor likes improvisation. I love it. So like that was my second city. You would watch the news and then you'd try to figure out how to make it funny, and most news is not funny, and entertaining and interesting. And to this day, Art Merrill was a brilliant puppeteer. And to this day, I love working with puppets. I was able later in life to guest on Sesame Street. And they said, we've never had anyone who really believed as much as you. I'm able to suspend disbelief and to really believe in whoever I'm talking to.
And were you comfortable on camera right away on television?
Yes. Yes, I would say so. I to the manner born. My mother, for a while in her youth, had been a dancer. And my grandmother was on radio with Allie B. Miles in the Midwest. So I kind of grew up as maybe third generation women who were in show business.
And you said there weren't really many other women around in the industry at that time?
In radio or television, certainly not in Hispanic countries, no.
So then what made you leave Puerto Rico?
I left Puerto Rico I did get divorced. It was extremely amicable, and we remained very close friends. He was going to move to Mexico, and I'd already, for a while, I forget to mention it, for a while I was working on a movie in Mexico City. So I went down there to make a movie. It was supposed to be very short, 6 months or something, and I was there for well over a year.
You were an actress in it?
I was an actress in the movie, yes. So I said, I keep acting. It has never really left me. What caused me to leave Puerto Rico was at that time, I was going back and we were going back and forth to the States. I kept getting fired. I have been fired, if you want to include NBC Universal, 21 times. So I was fired by WHOA, and then I was fired by WNEW. Then there was another station where I was doing news, and I walked in one morning and they had changed language. Uh, that's a big shock if you're the morning man, woman, person. So then we went back to Puerto Rico, and I got fired there from 2 or 3 stations. No, then we went to the States, and I got fired 2 or 3 times, and I just kept going back and forth. I was always fired. I never left a job that had a salary. Never, never.
What was that like for you?
To be fired? Well, no one likes it. I mean, not my favorite thing, but I'm told I take rejection quite well.
So at some point, I guess in the early 70s, you ended up in Miami?
I did.
And
That's going back and forth from the States to Puerto Rico, to the States to Puerto Rico. So then I got a job from Biggie Nevins at WIOD, Wonderful Isle of Dreams.
good name.
And WIOD, during the Second World War, there were a few stations that were designated, I think, my engineering is a bit fuzzy, but I think they had 3 points tower in the earth so that they could blast, if there were a national emergency, they could blast any other station off the air. Of course, they didn't do that. They were heavily watched by the FCC. But that station, WIOD, could be heard just about everywhere. It had one hell of a signal. And amazing things happened while I got the job working all night. I was the night person. And one of the things we did was we called up McDonald's and ordered 30,000 hamburgers. And that was used by Woody Allen, whom I told the story to in one of his movies. I had the good fortune of Jackie Gleason, who was living in Miami at that time doing the Jackie Gleason show, was a regular person who called in. And at one time, he began to ask my husband and me after we finished the show, because he was very nocturnal. We went back to his house, and I did play pool with Minnesota Fats. The strange people you meet. Let's see. Tennessee Williams was a regular on the show. He lived in the furthest down Key. Give me the name of the key. Key West. And he was a regular on the show. And that's when Kent State, I believe, took place.
So that would have been 1970?
70s, by then, yes, probably. And what I did was what I had done on radio. On radio in the middle of the night, when I was very tired, I would call the night person, usually a man, in Pittsburgh. and I'd connect the two stations. You didn't have to tell somebody they were on the air in those days. You could call anyone, and when they talked to you, you didn't have to identify, hi, you're live, you're on the air. So I would let Pittsburgh guy or wherever town I felt like. And during Kent State, the minute it came over the wire service, my husband called Kent State Radio, and we broadcast Kent State Radio from on our radio station at that time. And I think it was neat. I'm almost sure it was nominated for a Peabody, the work we did.
Wow. So you were doing radio and then you were doing television as well, right? On AM Miami?
I was doing radio on WIOD, and I was also on two other South Florida stations. One station was where I did a lot of interviewing of people who were famous. Philippe Halsman, the man who made people jump, the photographer. Buckminster Fuller drew me something he was inventing called the geodesic dome. I still have the first drawing of the geodesic dome. James Beard was selling cookbooks, and he came by regularly. I had a group of people who on that station came by regularly, who later went on to become very famous. I think it would be hard. Somewhere there's a list. And most of the people on the list are from radio and for that time. Wyatt Cooper, Anderson Cooper's father, was a regular. I don't even think Anderson or his mother know this, but they do know he wrote, but I don't think they knew he was a regular, and we would go out to dinner and then Wyatt Cooper would do the radio show. There's a lot of hidden pockets in that show. And then I was fired from that station and went to work on a station called Waves. We needed the money desperately. And I couldn't afford childcare, and I had 2 children in those days. The interesting thing about Waves was it was classical music. And that's where I developed a love of classical music. The pronunciation was another thing. I don't care how erudite you are, pronouncing all the names on a classical station, I take my hat off to you. I have a great thing that happened on that station. We did the show at noon from a very famous restaurant in a famous hotel. And I would interview all the classical musicians or important people who were staying at that hotel. And one day, the manager of that radio station came in. He said, "You know, we don't have anybody now, but you can interview me. What's it like to run classical music station?" So I said, "Well, okay." And we went on the air, and I said, "What's it like to run a classical music station?" And he said, "Expletive, great. And you didn't use naughty words in those days." I had been trained from all my years in radio. And then I looked at him and I changed the subject. "Well, how'd you get involved in radio?" Expletive, expletive, expletive. It's much worse when I can tell it off the air. But I saw my entire career go down the tubes. And then the guy just looked at me and laughed and said, I put on a repeat. You're not on the air. Now, for a station manager to do that on live radio, that's really, really something.
I mean, were you comfortable interviewing people right away? What were your preparations like for interviewing?
We didn't have, you couldn't look anybody up. You could have an Encyclopedia Britannica 30 years old or something like that. You couldn't look anybody up. So you had to go on your knowledge. Remember, a reader is a reader is a reader. You had to go on your knowledge. And they didn't even in those days give you a resume of anything. You learned to interview anybody flying blind. And one of the other jobs I had around that time was working for the wire services. I worked for Reuters and I worked for AP International. And the reason was I spoke 3 of the languages that they, wire services would need to send somebody to a place. So, for example, they sent me to interview Papa Doc in Haiti during the time of the heavy Tantamaku. I'm not so sure there still isn't a Tantamaku, but they were very, was it the Olafson Hotel in downtown in Haiti? I think it was. And they said, just be very careful, the room's bugged. So my husband and I were very careful, the room is bugged. And they kept me there waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, I got to talk to Papa Doc, and he only wanted to speak, the man was fluent in English. He only wanted to speak Haitian French. Now, I spoke French, but not well enough to be on the air. So it blew. The one really good interview that I could have sold anywhere just blew up in my face. Because you can't, as an interviewer, keep saying, what? What is that word? No. So, but I did get to go to a lot of South American countries and Central American countries and report on things that were going on. Usually, when you have something going on in a country, there is a group of news people who go. And what they do is the rest of us sit in a bar and drink, and one goes out and finds the story, and then comes back and tells the rest of them. I think people who know me know I'm famous for dragging a dead body so that the photographer for the news service could get better light on the body. He said, will you help me? This guy's dead and we want to put it in the service. So we dragged the body and he took the picture, and that picture was one of the top award-winning war pictures for the country. I will not mention the country.
Wow.
That was. So I learned a lot. I learned how to drink with fellow news people in a bar.
Getting quite the life experience here, and
yes,
we're only in the early 1970s.
I know. I warned everybody.
It's a lot.
I said, interview everybody at 40, and it'll be an easy interview. Don't wait.
So let's go back to Miami then. There were several radio shows that you were working on, and then at what point did you get on AM Miami?
I don't know. Somebody, I bugged them or my husband bugged them till somebody hired me for AM Miami. And it was the typical ABC Miami show, a typical ABC Good Morning Miami show, or Good Morning ABC show, which they're still doing a reincarnation of that on today's television. It was, again, a lot of celebrities, people who wrote books. You can always count on people who write books to come through town and to be on your show. There was one point at which I had just interviewed a lion tamer, and I looked up and I said, "And that's it for today." And when the lion, way over in the back of the camera, saw me, he ran for me. And the end of the show, too bad they didn't tape those things, is me, head over tea kettle, with a lion standing over me. And I said, if that doesn't get some press, I don't know what will. Today, that would be on, it would be everywhere. A lot of hits on that.
Mm-hmm. As the host of the show, did you have a lot of input on who the guests were and who would be interviewed?
No, I frankly didn't care.
Why is that?
Well, you can't produce yourself. I have nothing but bad things to say about men who wear suits who are in charge of network and cable television stations and radio stations. But I've nothing but good things to say about producers. They do the work. They know their job. If somebody is coming into town, they have the taste and the intelligence, or they did in my day, and I have nothing but respect for them. And so, no, I didn't try. I'm not a control freak, as most people will tell you. I'm the opposite. Who cares? Is more my attitude.
So you interviewed people on radio and on television.
At the same time.
And
now, there were people that I did on WIOD, and I did them at lunch, and I even did them on television. A famous actor who said, "Are you the only person who works in this town?" He was on my morning show, my noon show, and my night show.
did you have a preference between working on radio and television?
I always preferred radio.
Why?
I'm sorry that there is no, by the way, there is no such thing as radio. People who get on a computer call themselves a radio station. That's not radio. Radio disappeared a number of years ago, completely disappeared. Radio had the theater of the imagination. It had you told a story, and people imagined that story their own way, with their own characters, their own lighting, their own sets. You had to bring something to radio. Larry King did radio very, very well. He wrote The Christmas Story and never lived to see it become as big as it is, about a guy who wants a BB gun for Christmas. Now, that man could weave a tale. I apologize to him. It'll come to me. He could weave a tale and tell a story. When I had no guest on the radio in the middle of the night, I would tell stories and have people, they would imagine what was happening in that story. Or I'd just tell them about my day and they would imagine. No, you had to bring television, you just sit there, duh, couch potato, duh. But radio, you had to bring something to it. And it did me in good stead to be able to learn to do that.
So then after Miami, you went to New York?
When we asked for a $5 raise from WIOD. The other stations had already fired me. The classical had changed into not being classical. I think it was sports. I'm gone. Sports, I'm gone. and the other station had fired me. And then WIOD, I asked for a $5 a week raise. I was doing something like putting my kids in the car and having them sleep in the car in front of the radio station because I couldn't afford help. And I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud of the things I had to do to the children to support them. But the only place we could get a job was in Hartford, Connecticut. Actually, it was Guilford, Connecticut. When we packed up our car and when we drove there, the radio station was in a strip mall, and it had the call letters, and it had bullet holes in the glass. So I said to my husband, honey, it's obvious that this is not the most popular radio station in town. It was a liberal radio station in an ultra-conservative market. I went to the manager after I'd worked there a few days and said, why don't we bury the station? Buy a pine box, throw all your tapes and everything, carry it through town, and come out as not a liberal and not a conservative radio station, but just as a radio station. He thought that was a terrible idea. To this day, I still think it was brilliant. So I worked there, and my husband worked as a waiter in an Italian restaurant. There is nothing even slightly Italian about my husband. He's Norwegian descent. And we would count his tips every night. The children and I would count his tips. We lived in a house that had no furniture. We had 4 sleeping bags, and that's what we had. And then when I got fired from being too middle of the road for that station, then we went back to Puerto Rico and couldn't find a job. Always go home because you can speak Spanish. They didn't want me. And then we came to New York. Why? I have no idea. It was the summer. We got a teacher's apartment in Germantown, all furnished, that she was leaving for the summer. So we had a very inexpensive place. And my husband and I went out job hunting in, of all places, New York City.
And how did that work out?
I don't remember what our first job was. It was probably...
Was 1010 Wins around that time?
No, it was 1010 Wins was after WNEW. Stations were all AM. Stations split into AM and FM. WNEW was one of the most popular stations in America. It had Ted Brown and the Redhead. It had amazing disc jockeys, the top of the top of the top. So, some bright-eyed suit decides, hey, we got an all-male station. Why don't we have an all-female station? Now, there's only one trouble with that. If you've kept women out of radio and out of being rock disc jockeys, and you're going to have an all-female rock disc jockey stations, where are they going to come from? But suits don't think like that. Suits come up through sales usually, and this'll sell, all women. So I became the woman because, yes, I could do radio, and I was the morning man. And then they hired some women from other countries. and they kept not showing up. So I would do my shift and the shift of the person after me. It's interesting that, and then eventually they gave up that idea. But it's interesting that when WNEW FM celebrated its big anniversary, I was the first person on their air the first moment the station was born. They didn't even invite me to the party. So, you know, there's somebody there that still couldn't give a damn.
So again, you're working in radio, and then you also start to work in television again
I do.
with WPIX.
I start to work on television, and I think it may have been WPIX. I think the first day was election day that I was hired, and they sent me to the barrio. Hi, Sally, Jessy, Raphael, and we're voting for senator, governor, and whatever else, because I spoke Spanish. I was the only one they had at that time. People didn't hire Hispanics, and they needed somebody who wasn't Hispanic, but who was Hispanic. So there you go. And from there, I did get the job as anchor woman on Pix. Pix still with Paul Bloom as anchorman. They still to this day don't know I was their anchor woman. And I was their anchor woman for about almost 2 years.
So is this a primetime anchor?
Oh, yes.
So what was that experience like?
It was a pretty bad experience.
Why?
They had the idea at Pix that if they could only make me into a blonde, long blonde hair, beautiful starlet look, looking up to a man, that would work very well. Obviously, it didn't work very well.
Had you experienced that before? Someone trying to mess with your image?
Nobody up till that time, because of working in Puerto Rico and in Miami, no one had tried to make me make me look a certain way. Can you dye it? Can you wear a girdle? Can you grow your hair? Can you make it blonde? Can you get blue contacts? Can you, in other words, that wasn't me, and it never had been me. And it was pretty awful. It was a pretty awful time. They gave me a hard time. When I eventually, I think Paul Bloom told them, if you fire her, I leave too, that was amazing. That was really amazing. And he did. He went to San Diego, I believe. Have not heard from him since, but they're very decent broadcasters.